All right, guys, here we go with Chapter 27, Macroeconomic Relationships. So basically what we're going to look at here is consumption and savings. So our disposable income, which is the income we have after we pay taxes, is going to be the primary determinant here. We can't choose to pay taxes, we just have to. So the leftovers are going to be what we're really looking at here. And it's a direct relationship between consumption and saving. Okay, so the more money we have, the more of both consumption and saving we can do. Our saving schedule is going to be basically our disposable income after we subtract what we consume. Okay, and then we can also have dis-saving. So dis-saving is the idea that we spend more than we earn and therefore decrease previous savings, or of course, spend on credit. So this 45-degree line is the reference line that just kind of shows a situation where you spend every dollar that you earn. Okay, so the red line, if you make $6,000, you spend $6,000. If you make $7,000, you spend $7,000. And then different years, you can see what the United States was doing in billions of dollars. So we made as a group in 1999 a little bit less than 7 trillion, it looks like, and spent just a little bit less. Okay, so the difference between the two is saving. All right. So you can see here that you have what we call the average propensity to consume and the average propensity to save, or APS or APC. And then we also have our marginal propensity to consume and our marginal propensity to save. So this is what we're going to be mostly concerned with. So if we make an additional dollar, how much of the additional dollar do we spend? Okay, and in the United States, for this example, we're going to say that if we make $1 extra, then we are going to spend 75 cents of it, and we're going to save 25 cents of it. Okay, so what you're seeing now is our level of consumption and our level of income here. So if we make only $370, then we have to spend $375. So we're actually going to dis-save in order to do that. If we make a higher income of $390, then we're not going to save anything. Once we make $410, then you'll see that we do get to start saving a little bit. Okay, and then this becomes our saving number. And then our average propensities are going to fall as our average propensity to save rises. Okay, but we want to pay mostly attention to the marginal propensity. What extra do we spend? What extra do we save when we earn an additional dollar? Okay, so keep that in mind. So here's our savings schedule. All right, so what you're noticing is this is just the previous chart. Okay, so down here when we are below 390, we actually dis-save. Once we cross that, then we start to save. The difference between the two is going to be savings. All right, so here's our savings schedule. It's the same sort of deal. It's just we're now graphing that line. Okay, so we save nothing if we make below 390, and then we start to save if we get above 390. All right, so our average propensity just takes our consumption, and when we divide by our income, that's always going to give us our average propensity to consume. And then we do the same thing with savings. So APC, what we consume on average, plus what we save on average, must always equal 1. That's just math, nothing crazy there. So you can see different countries consume at different rates. The United States obviously consumes very high, and then there are other nations that consume much lower. Asian nations, which aren't on here, tend to consume even lower still. So the marginal propensity to consume is the proportion of a change in income consumed. So when we make an additional dollar, how much of that additional dollar do we spend? When we make an additional dollar, how much of that additional dollar do we save? Again, MPC plus MPS has to equal 1. So we get our change in consumption over our change in income. That will give us our MPC. Then our change in saving over our change in income will give us MPS. And you're going to see why this matters in a little bit. All right, so once again, we get kind of some rise over run. We have our change in consumption of 15, our change in disposable income of 20, so this run, this rise, so rise over run gives us 0.75. 15 over 20 is 0.75. And then we know that this then has to equal 1.25 plus 0.75. And it does, sure enough. All right, so there are some non-income determinants, but disposable income is the main determinant. So when our wealth changes, so not our income, but our wealth, this wealth, of course, is what we've stored up over a long period of time. When that changes, that can drive our consuming patterns. Borrowing, when borrowing is really cheap, when interest rates are low, we tend to spend more. When interest rates are high, we tend to spend less. Expectations, if we think that the economy is going to be good, we will spend more today, whereas if we think the economy is going to be bad, we will spend less today. And then real interest rates is very connected to borrowing. All right. So some other, when we are nominal GDP doesn't really matter here. We have to be always thinking about real GDP. And notice that the schedule is not always 100% constant. Taxation has a big effect here. There can be simultaneous shifts, though not in any of our examples. And there is an assumption that this is very stable, but there are examples where it is not stable, though it is relatively stable over time. So you see now our shifts of the schedule. When some of those determinants shift, you can see that obviously the reference line remains the same, but the reference line remains the same, but our C and S will change. Okay, so here we are saving more, and here we are saving less. Okay. All right, so there's a yellow box on page 554. So take a look at that, okay? We're going to talk about this in class, but make sure that you have read that by the time we get back to class. All right, interest rate and investment. So the expected rate of return versus the real interest rate is going to give us an investment demand curve. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So our demand curve is sloping downward, so we call this ID, investment demand, and it's sloping downward. When interest rates are high, we will demand very few dollars to borrow. When interest rates are low, we will demand lots of dollars. Okay, so here, low interest rates, high demand, high interest rates, low demand. Okay, and these are investment dollars, and this is what we would expect. The primary investors, of course, are businesses, and we said that, you know, when the deal makes sense, businesses will always invest. It's just very difficult for a deal to make sense very often when we have really high interest rates. So that's why we see relatively low investment numbers, investment demand, when we have high interest rates. So these are some things that can shift the investment demand. You can pause and take a read. And here's what the investment demand shifts will look like. Just it'll move to the right or it'll move to the left. So you can see who's doing the investment as a percentage of GDP. You've got South Korea leading the pack there. So we're going to talk about this, but investment is very unstable. We've kind of mentioned it before. So we're going to talk about this in class. Remind me to bring that up. Gross investment versus GDP. So GDP growth rates, change rates, I guess, are in blue. And investment, you know, is basically just a hyper-exaggerated version of GDP. So when investment goes up, GDP goes up, but though not as much, because IG is only a portion of GDP, and the rest is more constant. But it's an interesting thing to take a look at. Now, the multiplier effect is really kind of a common question on the AP test, and it matters. So here's the basic idea of it. When I spend money, the person that I give my money to now has more money to spend. And that's the idea behind the multiplier. So if I just spend $1,000 at a store, the owner of that store now has an extra $1,000. So then they go and spend more. So then somebody else goes and spends more and more and more and more. This multiplier effect is part of the reason that the government feels like it can do monetary or fiscal policy changes in order to make things better. Because by spending X number of dollars that the government spends, by putting all of that money into people's pockets, then people will start spending more money. And by maybe an investment of only $1 trillion, they can get an economic impact of $3 trillion or $5 trillion or something like that. So the multiplier is the change in real GDP over the initial change in spending. And maybe the better idea is once we have a multiplier effect that we've solved for, kind of figuring out over time, then once we know what that multiplier is, we can say, well, if the government's just going to change spending by this amount, then that will be our change in GDP. So if we think that the multiplier, for example, is 5, and we spend $1 trillion that was sort of unexpected, then we would have a $5 trillion change in GDP. That's the math, okay? So let's look at it. So we have an increase in investment of $5. So our marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. So of that additional $5, that's our change in income, $3.75 will get spent and $1.25 will get saved. So this kind of leaks out, okay? So what we save does not get re-spent. So in the first round, $5 gets spent, $1.25 gets saved, which leaves $3.75 to come down to the second round. 75% of $3.75 is $2.81, so that gets spent in the third round, okay? And basically, you just keep on going until this number goes down to 0. Notice it goes to all other rounds. So because we have a 0.75 and a $5 change in income, we can do the math to get $20, and you will see what that looks like in a second. So, assuming that we know our marginal propensity to consume, 0.75, we take 1 minus 0.75 is 0.25, rather, and then 1 divided by 0.25 gives us our multiplier, okay? So you can read through this, give it a pause. But here's a list. If we spend 0.9, then that means if we spend 90% basically of our additional dollars, we spend 90% of our additional dollars, then what that means is an investment of $1 will yield us $10. Okay? If we spend 80%, if we spend 75, so you can just see what these multipliers are. Obviously, the more of a dollar we spend, the greater the impact. Okay, and we're going to obviously talk about this in class too, and you have it in your packet. So of course, there are some economists who really doubt that the multiplier works this way for all practical purposes. And the reasons for that are, we've also got to pay taxes. It's not just what we save. There's inflation. We buy imported goods. So if the extra money gets spent on imports, then it doesn't really help us because that money leaves and goes back to the country where the imports were made. So most economists would say that just going back to this number, we don't necessarily have to disagree on what the MPC is, but they would say that an MPC of 0.9 doesn't actually give us this full 10 multiplier. So some economists would go so far as to say that the multiplier effect isn't real at all. These, of course, would be the people who probably do not favor any kind of government intervention on behalf of the economy. So squaring the economic circle is at the end of chapter 27, and I would like you to read that as well. We'll talk about it during class. And that's the end of chapter 27. Thanks, guys.